Oh, you're close.
Oh, we're on.
Hot night.
I wonder if people heard you say, "Get off my lawn."
Yeah. Okay. Well, good morning. It is 9:30 and the live stream has begun. Terry told me it was Scott, Jonathan, and
Jared.
Jared. Okay. Scott, Jonathan, and Jared.
It's always Jared. He won't tell me no.
Yeah, we'll get.
I just hand it to him.
Yeah, we'll give it another 30 seconds. We still got a lot of folks coming in here. So while folks are coming in, we're in lesson 3 of Living Cross-Shaped Lives, and today I was warning Terry we're going to nerd out a little bit on some of the historical things that are going on. Right before we offer prayer, I just wanted to say, one of the things that have been so beneficial about the sermons from Corinthians over the last 20 years is that we're getting the cultural aspect, and we're starting to see things a little more through the lens or the eyes of a first century person who had received the letter, and that's really very valuable for us. So without further commentary, we'll ask Jonathan, would you lead us in prayer, and we'll start our class.
God and our Father in heaven, we are so blessed to be gathered here to worship you this morning. And Father, as we go through this study, we ask that you be with Joe and Terry as they lead the discussion, that the things that they bring out from your word will be truth, will be useful for us in our lives, and will direct us in a way that we need to go. And Father, we pray for ourselves as listeners and as students that we will always strive to better understand your word, to write it on our hearts. And as we are learning about Jesus and the cross and the path that he set for us, we ask that you help keep our feet on that path, that we will follow in his footsteps, bearing our cross, and that we will strive in every decision to live like him. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. All right. So, there's if we were going to put a Slido up this morning, it'd just be a yes/no. Here's the question. Here's the Slido question. Let's just imagine technology has put it up there, but we're going to use the old-fashioned raise our hand kind of deal. Is God intentional about his timing? Okay, so a lot of nods. Are the important things ever left time-wise to happenstance? They're not, are they? God's intentional about. Remember when Jesus is in his ministry, and several times he'll say this: "Is not yet time. It is not my time." There was an intentionality about the timing of the crucifixion. But there's also an intentionality about the method of Jesus's death, and we're going to take a look. We're going to kind of nerd out historically this morning. Some folks are going to enjoy that. Some folks are going to feel like they're back in junior high, and they're going to want to be put into detention rather than sit through it. But I think it will be helpful to get some of the historical pieces of this. So, what? I'm going to sidewhack Terry here. What do you think of when you think of the Roman cross, Terry?
Well, I think the first thing that comes to my mind is how we've romanticized something that would have never been romanticized back then.
Okay, so put yourself in first century.
Yeah, the cross in the first century is hideous. It is, well, from a standpoint of, if you're a slave, it's something to be feared, or if you're a non-Roman citizen or lower class, it's the ultimate judgment, if you will. If you're a Roman citizen who's protected, it is somewhat of a sadistic entertainment form. And that's one of the interesting things about Roman culture. We'll talk a little bit about the Pax Romana and what that means today, which is another one of those nerdy things. But it just means Roman peace. But what's interesting is how that the Roman peace was secured through brutality. And the cross is probably symbolic of that brutality more than anything else for the individual. And that's the key from that standpoint.
Yeah, there's really a lot to unpack there, and we'll take a look, Lord willing, at as much as we can this morning. The Romans did not invent the cross as a form of torture or a form of execution. It kind of started in the Persian Empire, and they really just used trees, and they'd find a standing tree, and then they would crucify someone up. But it wasn't as widespread as it becomes in the Roman Empire. As a matter of fact, kind of the turning point is, interestingly, 4 BC, and I forget the name of the Roman general, but he comes in and he's irritated. Irritated is a mild word, I guess, with the Jews, and he crucifies 2,000 Jews, apparently at the same time. And from that point, they continued to perfect it, and they perfected this method of execution. And Terry just mentioned the fact that we've romanticized it, and I think there's an intentionality behind that as well in God's plan, is that we're going to take a look at the fact that it's so vulgar in the first century that it's even a word that one of the historians says should not even cross the lips of a Roman or a free man. So it was like a curse word in Roman culture. That's how low and degrading the cross was.
Yeah, and so the Persians, it was more of an impalement, really, and the Greeks, it was still more of an impalement, although we see some modifications. But there's a story where Alexander the Great hangs thousands of enemy soldiers on trees, and there's a story where under Rome, they kill, I think it's like 6,000 Spartan soldiers by this method. So there's a lot of these things. What they did is they really perfected the cross and what became crucifixion. The impalement made people die faster than this. So what they really did was they found a way to hang you up as a public spectacle, and you could take days to die. And that was the whole reason for what they developed crucifixion into. They wanted it to be lengthy, and you need to understand that they had ways of hastening it. We see that in the story of Jesus. And they cooperate in the story of Jesus because of a high feast day. But in the normal circumstances, Jesus and those two thieves would have hung there until they died naturally, and hung there a while longer, by the way.
They would have quite a while.
Yeah, they would be, and so everybody who walked by would see. And in some ways, what's interesting is this actually created Jesus' specific instance, I think, not only because of his notoriety, but also because the Jews knew he was only going to be there for a matter of hours because of the Passover. So it created a larger crowd. When you talk about timing and everything, it created a larger crowd for this crucifixion. Normally, a crucifixion would have been more like a drive-by spectator event, because you're not going to stand there for 4 days to watch somebody die. You would pass by on your way, and you would see what's going on, and then you would continue to go. But here with Jesus, with a combination of the hatred for him by the Jews, but also the limited amount of time, this was a spectacle.
Yep. And just to put it in today's, nail it down to what it would look like today, if our mayor, Tony Picklesheimer, had the authority to crucify us, you want to take a guess where it would be? There, or probably at the crossroads of Chelsea Road and 280.
Where the big kaboom is, that's where it would be.
It would be where everybody had to pass by it. And the reason behind that is, Terry just mentioned the whole Spartan army thing. It was a way of saying, you lost. We're the victors, you're not.
And that went on for a long time. You go back to the stories of like when Philistines take the ark, that's what that was about. You lost, we got your God. You think about when Saul takes Agag from the Amalekites, he's taking a trophy, is what he's doing, to make sure that the Amalekites and Agag know you lost. Samson is a living trophy with his eye gouged out so that people can see we defeated Israel and their mighty, powerful judge. This idea of collecting trophies, whether it was skin of a man or the man himself or the body or the god, all of those things were common in ancient culture. And so you have to think about that. It was just a more brutal way of life at that point.
And so when you say you're a Spartan and you see 6,000 of your compatriots hanging from crosses, are you more willing to raise the white flag at that point and say, yeah, you are? And it was a way to subjugate. It was a way to beat people down to accept Roman values, Roman viewpoints, Roman culture, Roman society. And it was we're the victors, you're the losers. Here's what's in store for you if you get out of line with Rome. And so I did want to amplify, and it was going to be a later point, but I want to amplify the timing, Terry, of Jesus being on the cross, because I think we need to also nail down it was not a quick death. I mean, some people had heart attacks and they would die quickly, but that was an underlying medical condition. It was days. And here's the other thing: your feet were probably no higher off the ground if that high is the chair that you're sitting on. And not to get overly graphic, but you do need. Dogs were not pets. They moved in packs and roamed around like you think of coyotes today. And so you were low enough for the dogs, and you were high enough for the birds. And I'll just end the conversation right there.
And the other thing about this is, like, to go back to the romanticization, it's not even just that we put crosses everywhere, but even the pictures of the crucifixion that we have that in our minds, or maybe we see a cross on a hill, even those are more romantic than what actually is going on. I mean, the reality is that the victim of crucifixion was not clothed from the time that he was scourged forward. So when you're walking through the streets, you're walking as one who's been brutally beaten within an inch of your life. Some people never made it to the cross. They died at the scourging stump. You're carrying the total weight of the cross would have been about 300 pounds, but the crossbeam about 100 pounds. You're carrying that on your back, and you are completely naked. And so you become this public spectacle. And the people would come out. In fact, under normal circumstances, more people would gather for the parade to the cross than at the foot of a cross for a normal criminal. It's one of the interesting things, except in Jesus' case. So what you have here is this concept of we are going to publicly degrade and humiliate this person as much as possible, while also piling upon them the ultimate form of execution. You know, our executions today are quick. We try to make them what we even call, if you think about this, humane. A humane execution, right? Injection is fast. In fact, if it's not fast enough, the family can sue the government and will win, which is weird, right? There's nothing humane about this. Nothing at all. This is as inhumane as they could possibly make it.
And here's a bone for the English teachers. The word excruciating.
There it is, excruciating.
Excruciating comes out of the cross. So that word that we associate with the ultimate pain means out of the cross. So I think we've probably
one last thing about the cross, by the way, is most of them look like a T, not like what we think about. I mean, listen, I only point that out just to show. Again, it's just structurally more sound to put a crossbeam on top of a post, and they did that because it was easy to lift the man up. You know, they didn't nail him to a full cross and then slide it in the hole. If you've ever even tried to put up a mailbox, you know that doesn't work right? There's a 300-pound cross with probably a 200-pound man hanging off of it. The beam the post is in the ground permanent, and they lift him up by his arms nailed to a cross beam and set him on top of the post. But they had perfected all of that. That's the point of that.
So, back to the original conversation, God's timing, God's intentionality about all this. The cross was a Roman curse word, but it's not just the Romans. We look at Deuteronomy 21 and right around verse 20, 22, 23, right in that section. What did the Jews think about those who were hung from a tree? They were cursed. So when you were cursed, and to amplify that, Eric, when you were cursed, was God somehow involved in that as well? If you were allowed to be cursed? Yeah, absolutely.
Outside the camp.
Out.
They hung on a tree outside the camp.
Okay. So universally, from the most religious of, or the closest to God's faithfulness and God's righteousness were the Jews, to the most pagan of the time, the cross would have been something. I'm going to read this. The Roman historian said, only slaves, disgraced soldiers, Christians, and foreigners. I want you to stew on that just a little bit. That's the only people that are allowed to be put on a cross.
Here's the interesting about the Jewish law. This is a corpse being hung on a tree. They're already dead. They were stoned and then hung for public display. And that's very different. And they were taken down at the end of the day, or the land itself would become cursed where they hung. And that's the old law. So it's interesting, and what you see in that is the reason it was a curse was what they added to the stoning, which was the judgment, was the public humiliation of the criminal. But also it was a warning. It was to serve as a warning to the people, just like we talked earlier about the Spartans and so forth, is, hey, don't do this because this is your end. Mm-hmm. It was the way of a public declaration that this individual had been executed under the capital laws of the Torah. And it was limited, and they weren't killed by being hung. They were already dead when they were hung. The literal translation actually says that they're dead first, then hung, is the way that the literal translation reads. So just want to point out that that's a distinct difference. God's people are not, they're not executing people the same way the Romans are. But there is a connection.
Yeah. It's not a form of torture, and it's not a form of entertainment. So in Daniel, the 2nd chapter, we see the king having this dream, this vision of the future, and he can't understand it. And Daniel lays out the dream, and we see the timing of the empires that are coming from the time of Daniel going forward, from the Babylonians to the Medo-Persians to the Greeks to now the Romans being in charge. And we're going to see at this point in time that the Romans perfect the cross as a form of humiliation, torture, execution, all the other things that we've talked about. It becomes the method of execution. It becomes, it's widely, Jews see it as a curse, the Romans see it as something vulgar, but it's what God chooses for His Son to experience for us. And we've done all this kind of pounding we go, Jesus died for my sins, which is true. Jesus excruciated for my sins, which is true. Jesus was humiliated for my sin, which is true. There's just so many levels to that. When we see what He was willing to do, we can never minimize the garden. And what I mean by the garden, I mean the Garden of Gethsemane at this point, is where Jesus knows what's coming, and He says, not my will, but your will be done, which is just the exact opposite of what we'd said in the Garden of Eden. Not your will, God, but my will be done. And Jesus just does just the opposite. Well, let's take a look at some of the questions here.
I'll also point out that the depth of depravity of this culture is seen through the cross. The idea that some of these people got enjoyment from this type of execution illustrates the depravity of the Roman Empire. And so and I just point that out to say, when we think that we're living in the worst of times, I often say, I'm not sure we're there yet. I think there's some worse cultures than us. And this is a pretty bad culture. also the depth of the hatred of the Jewish leaders that they would put Jesus through this form of execution willingly. So there's a lot of things that the cross signifies and means about that time when we understand its historical significance.
Yeah. We're going to jump all the way down to the fourth question. We've already kind of rolled through the first three more or less. But the fourth question is about Barabbas. I wanted us to kind of consider some of the wordplay that's going on here with Barabbas, but more specifically and more to the point, what's going on from a redemption standpoint here when we see Barabbas? And we all know the story, and for anyone who doesn't recall it right off the top, is that Barabbas is the one that's released. But someone tell us a little bit about Barabbas and who he was personally. And Terry and I have
rebel of some sort.
okay.
I know that, he was no friend of the rebel.
Okay.
So he's a rebel, just to repeat that. He's a
Yeah.
rebel.
An insurrectionist, a rebel, and he had committed murder in the. And so, the second part, just kind of housekeeping. He's in jail. He's awaiting the cross.
It's also interesting that an insurrectionist, we would think, might be looked down upon, but by half the Jewish population, they would support him.
Yeah, maybe even more.
Maybe
Yeah.
even more.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting here, Pilate's choice, but him being an insurrectionist for the half or the group that did not approve of his actions, it was because the more insurrection that happened, the more brutality from Rome on your region would occur. So you have to kind of see that gets into the Pax Romana and how they were able to maintain that peace. We'll talk about it in a minute. But so it's very interesting in that sense to think about all of that historically.
And here's the other thing. His name is very instructive. When we hear the word Simon Bar-Jonah, have we ever considered what the Bar-Jonah means? Because it means, that word gets thrown around a fair amount in Scripture. It means son of. Bar means son of. So Simon Bar-Jonah means you're the son of Jonah. This fella is Barabbas. He's the son of the Father.
And he's probably Jesus Barabbas. Because in a lot of manuscripts, we actually have him in Matthew being notated as Jesus Barabbas. He's not in our translations because he's not in all of the manuscripts. But when you think about that, he's in several. When you think about that, it would be highly unusual for a scribe to just add that in, because if you accept especially that Jesus is the Messiah and they treat it with the same significance as the word, let's say Yahweh, they would try to avoid adding those kind of things in. So we lean towards the idea that this is an offering of Jesus, Son of the Father, or Jesus the Messiah, which is the way that Pilate essentially words the two.
And actually, there is a historical account, and I'm going to get it wrong. I'm going to say Eusebius was the one who wrote this, but he was incensed that Jesus should not be attached to Barabbas, and at any rate, that's kind of a historical.
And it was a common name. I think that's the thing.
Yeah.
It's a common name. So,
but it's intentional.
yeah.
And so we see Jesus, Son of the Father, or even if we take that out, the Son of the Father, who is guilty, being released for the Son of the Father who's innocent. And so what we see in this exchange, we should see redemption, we should see salvation, because the sinless is paying the price for the guilty. He's paying the price that the guilty deserves. And it is so rich. When we say God's intentional, it's just, you just can't miss some of these things.
My favorite thing about Barabbas is that he would have been in a prison cell close enough to have heard the mob. And so as this is going on and Pilate's offering this up, what he hears the mob yell first, without the context of who do you want released, is Barabbas, right? And then Pilate says, which would not have been as loud, what do I do with Jesus the Christ? Crucify him. And so you have this wordplay of in the cell, Barabbas is hearing his name yelled, followed by crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. And then not long after that, the cell door is going to open Well, in his mind, what do you think more than likely is going to be in his mind? It's time to die. And then they're going to say, you get to go free. And the thought there is, as well, that's powerful to think about, that cross between those two thieves was reserved for Barabbas that day. It was his cross. And Jesus of Nazareth takes his place, and he gets to walk free. It's a beautiful picture of grace and what Jesus does for us, that we are Barabbas.
And he's not worthy
Right.
of that. That's the...
Well,
that's
because
it.
we're insurrectionists as well.
Right. We have raised our fists against God and said we want to do it our way. Get a mic,
Yes,
Scott.
I got it, Mike.
Okay.
See, I don't think that we can put enough emphasis on the fact that Barabbas is us, right? I just don't think there's enough emphasis to be placed upon that. Every day that I live, and I think of, if I'm really thinking about that, I just realize that more and more. You know, I mean, we have to make it personal. It should touch us at the very core. You know, every day that Jesus today is the one. He gave his life for me, you know, and I'm not worthy of that. I don't know about everybody else in here, but I'm not worthy of that.
Here's another kind of historical nerdy thing about Barabbas. I have personally a tendency of overlooking. He was trying to cleanse Israel of its filth, its uncleanness.
He's trying to overthrow Rome.
He's
too.
trying to overthrow Rome. I mean, that's the whole point.
He's
But
doing what they want.
he's doing, and he's also seeing himself as righteous.
Yep.
Barabbas would have seen himself as righteous, and a lot of his countrymen would have agreed that he's righteous. So when we think, why would they take this murderer out? Well, the Jews are like, yes, you know. To Terry's point earlier, the council just wanted to keep their power, and they made that clear when they talked about killing Lazarus. He said, "Oh, we're going to lose our place," and they were going to lose their power. They felt like they had to kill Jesus and kill the evidence. Well, there's another one. This point is we don't make it often enough. Question 5. Who gets tasked with telling the good news about the resurrection first? Okay,
Mary Magdalene.
all right. And the women.
Women.
Yeah, and the women. So when we talk about intentionality, God uses the most hideous form of execution, but there are a lot of things tied to that. And when Jesus will later say, remember class 1, Jesus repeats 3 times, take up your cross, follow me. Deny self, take up your cross, follow me.
There's so much shame, honor stuff in here, and
Yeah,
I don't
yeah,
want to
it
get so
can-
sidetracked.
yeah,
but
We'll be there all day.
yeah, being from Galilee would have been low on the honor scale.
Mm-hmm.
Women are low on the honor scale. Being crucified is low on the honor scale.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, everything about this story of Jesus flips the cultural shame, honor, value system upside down.
Yep.
Every part of it. And it's just really important to kind of keep that in mind and see that in that sense.
So we made a point earlier in the class that God uses the small things and the things that are not, that don't seem big. In last week's lesson, we talked about Jesus, his birth, his hometown, the apparent a virgin having an illegitimate child.
is what
we're
it is.
struggling to
Yeah.
get that
Yeah.
out, but
Yeah.
all of these things, and then the death amplifies, and the method of death amplifies all that. That God takes the smallest things and He turns the world upside down on that. So the women are the first to go tell the good news. They're the first to tell the gospel. Jesus is risen. They knew He was dead. Eric?
I think it's significant too. I mean, it appears like they don't even his body. They don't even bear, I mean, I don't want to say strangers, but Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, those are the two that go and get the body and provided a place to be buried. I mean, he's been totally abandoned.
Right. And the women are
Even the women.
they're standing off because they're not going to get involved in, they're not going to do what the men are doing because they're subservient, but they're watching and making sure.
There is a point too that all of his friends would have no way to bury him here, just because they're from Galilee and they're poor. So a grave is something that a wealthy man owns.
Yeah.
And what we see really in Nicodemus and Joseph, to me, is the impact of Jesus' influence. But here are these leaders, these rulers, these rich men who are secretive disciples, I believe, at this point. That's my understanding of this. That expose themselves in order to provide Jesus with the honorable burial. And that's really what I think is the most interesting about who buries him, is they're essentially putting themselves on the line by doing this, as synagogue rulers and Jewish leaders, because the whole thing has been to get rid of this guy, and now they're giving him an honorable burial. They would have suffered for that,
Yeah.
for what they do, and that's the big takeaway from the burial.
It's an act of faith
On
on both ends, for sure.
And it's
so-
that story with Nicodemus that convinces me that here he comes at night at the beginning of John, right? And he's secretive and doesn't want anybody to know. And now his faith is such that he doesn't care about that anymore. And we see that growth in that belief.
Yep.
So,
Well, the Pax Romana in what we call what I termed the amazing reversal. About 8 to 6 BC, we have Augustus, and we get the first inscription. And it was probably called this before that, but he was called something specific. He was called the Son of God. Here, right before Jesus is born. And again, right before Jesus is born, Romans get really excited about this method of crucifixion. Everything's just kind of merging together. And so you have Augustus, who is the Son of God. And
heavy cult emperor worship begins with Augustus. It's part of the thing as
he's
well.
the first. Right. And all this historical timing and historical layering is all happening right at this moment in time. It is literally the crossroads of all of history, right here at the time of Jesus' birth. And that's intentional. God's very, very much intentional about that. So what is the message after all this is done? And we see Paul going, and once we've kind of cleaned up once we've kind of scrubbed all the negative images out of our mind, we see a lot of glory happening, don't we? What happens on the day of Pentecost? 3,000 souls, and the people of Jerusalem, they had favor with the people who were not yet Christians, and you see this amazing thing happening. But it's the weight of the cross is going to come up for sure, and especially going to come up in Greek society. But it's what strikes me is beyond amazing. Is you've got something. The people who are listening to this message and they've seen and heard the miracle, they have to get their minds over this concept of we had to have been cursed by God. So when we start seeing the level of faith that they jump to right from the very beginning, they also jump over, well, my parents didn't believe this. My rabbi doesn't believe this. There's a mountain that they're jumping over to become believers.
And one of the biggest obstacles is Roman Empire rules just with this power, this brutality of promise of force. And so for years, as you're waiting somebody to overthrow the Roman Empire, you're expecting somebody to come in and to overthrow by force, to answer Rome with Roman response, right? And that's how all of these, how did the Babylonians fall to the Persians? The Persians were more powerful, so they conquered them. Then Alexander the Great conquers the Persians. Then the Roman Empire conquers the Greeks. So you're expecting somebody to come in and to give you this physical victory of war. And Jesus does none of that.
Yeah. And you think about all the empires from 500, 600 BC coming forward, they'll have limited lifespans, don't they? I mean, they come in with force, and they win with force. Alexander the Great being one of the greatest military minds who ever existed, but his empire did not last long. You know, his life didn't last long, actually.
Yeah.
But and then Rome doesn't, Rome lasts a long time, but the greatest power on earth has only been around 250 almost, or somewhere in the two. and I'm-
250 years is the relative lifespan of an empire, essentially.
So power does not create a lasting empire, is what I'm saying. But what has existed for 2,000 years? The kingdom of Jesus has lasted for 2,000 years. And it's just so unlikely, right? He was crucified as a criminal. And he was given the worst possible death, the most humiliating death. They couldn't have testified that he was risen. The original teachers or the deliverers of the good news couldn't even testify in a Roman court that it happened. They would not allow female testimony in court. It seems everything's stacked against this ever getting off the ground. As a matter of fact, his disciples are hiding. And they're in an upper room and they're locking the door because they're scared to death that they are next to lose their lives. So does that look like the start of the greatest movement that has ever happened in history? It looks like it's so small and so weak and so broken, it's never going to go anywhere. And yet Rome collapses, Christianity flourishes, and that's what happened. You can't avoid that historical.
Well, and you think about, you started in the lesson with Daniel 2. I mean, it is the fulfillment of Daniel 2.
It is.
In the strictest sense, that here at this fourth phase represented in that statue comes this kingdom that's not made with hands, that shatters that fourth and final kingdom. And then this, if you remember, that stone becomes a mountain that covers the entire earth in that image. And so the hindsight is 20/20 certainly applies here, that we can look back and we can go, this is exactly what God said was going to happen. Mm-hmm. But what's really interesting about that is that the Jews knew those same prophecies and visions, and they weren't willing to accept that that's how it was going to happen. And I think that's really interesting to keep in mind. Those 120 disciples that Acts 1 opens up with, that are locked inside of a room, they're really questioning their life choices, for lack of a better explanation at that point, because they still have faith, but none of this is still making sense. It's not until the Comforter comes that later on, and we'll talk about this a little bit in the lesson today, that Paul describes that as the full revelation being made known. That once that's fully revealed through the Spirit, then this stuff starts, they start to have understanding. But right. There's not a full understanding when they're locked in that room and worried about what's going to happen next.
Yeah, and they're not even trusting each other. Thomas shows us that he's not there. And he's hearing 10 people, plus the women, say, uh-huh.
Yeah. That's what they said, yeah.
That he's risen. And Brandon, someone get Brandon, Brandon's gone.
I think it's interesting, too, that the Jews are still looking for that today. They're still looking for a conqueror king to cleanse the Holy Land of their enemies and rule. That's what they still want, and that's what they've still been taught to look for. But that's not the method that God chose. And because of that, they have missed the Messiah. They've missed God's Holy One. They missed him when he came, and so they're still looking for the wrong thing today. Yeah. In Zionist Israel, they still expect a conqueror to cleanse their land, even though they're ruling their land in a type of kingdom as it is, a democratic kingdom, but it's broken. Obviously, it's extremely broken because they have violence and war all the time. They still don't have what they thought that they were going to get, and they missed the Messiah.
Yeah.
A lot of Christians
I was going to say, it's not just the Jews.
Yeah, it's us.
The majority of Christians still think that's the focus. The majority of people who claim to follow Christ still hold on to that idea.
Even if you take Israel completely out of the formula, we still want our nation to exact punishment on our enemies from a show of force. I'll throw this out there. There's a movement that's been taking place in Iran that estimates that some close to 1 million people have converted from Islam to being Christians, mostly women. And a million's a big number. It's not enough to change the power structure in Iran. But I'm throwing that out there to say if Iran flips and becomes a Christian nation, God's behind that, and it's happening without a single bullet being fired. If that happens. I'm not saying that it will. I'm just saying when I read the number, 1 million converts in Iran, I go, I can't be. They all hate us. They all hate the concept of Jesus. That's not the case. Yeah, they don't.
Well, it's also interesting, though, that we think of that in political terms, but I got to say this about just the idea that there's 1 million in Iran, and will Iran become a Christian nation? I'm not sure that's even God's focus about what kind of nation Iran is. It's just,
Well, that's, you know what I'm saying.
it's the spread of the, and I just want to make sure we understand that. It's the spread of the gospel. That's all that matters. Wherever and however that happens, the truth about Jesus is the focal point, is what's important. Regardless of borders and boundaries and types of government and all of that stuff, all that matters is that people serve King Jesus. That's the focal point.
Yeah, he's that rock that destroys all the rest of the nations, the kingdom that will not be destroyed.
And that was my point rather than the political side of it. Poorly worded, but if the nation's going to change, it's going to change one heart, one soul at a time, hearing the message of Jesus and the good news. And Johnny has something to...
Yeah, I don't even know where to start. Correct me if I or disagree if this sounds way out there, but of course Iran's going to flip one day. It's ingrained in people and how God created people. Sure, there's a few out there that love force and want evil and want brutality, and that's just, maybe Satan owns them. But I think the majority of people, as they live, as they choose bad, good, over and over, you come to the truth that choosing good is better. It feels better. It's more peaceful. We talk about this kingdom that's lived for 2,000 years. What's different about it than all the other kingdoms? It's a kingdom of peace. Every other kingdom's been a kingdom of war. And so I think it's just ingrained in how we were built from the beginning. Yes, we fell. Yes, we are corrupted. But there's still something in us that we all, it's hard to say all, but most, as they live, experience life, learn things, see truths, learn truths around them, I think it's just ingrained in us. We want good.
I like to feel that way. Sometimes I'm on that side of the fence and sometimes on the other. But I also, we're reaching the last couple of minutes. Where I wanted to land with this is to point out how impossible this looks and how everything seems stacked against this. When we go back and we look at 2,000 years and we go, okay, well, that's the way it should have happened. Well, put yourself back then. And so they were committing their lives to a dead king, to a crucified king, to someone who was poor, someone who never traveled beyond the borders of his nation, more or less. I mean, you exclude the Syrophoenician event, but they never left the border of their nation. He wasn't a rabbi. in the classical sense. He wasn't a person of power, influence, fame, well, fame to some extent. Fame when it worked out for people who were seeking things for themselves. But the movement got down to very few people in hiding, fearful for their lives, and it revolves around a cross. It revolves around humiliation and the most unlikely events ever in human history. And you see what happens.
And I'll close with this. It doesn't make sense, and yet it makes perfect sense if you start at the garden. That man chose the wrong tree. And so Jesus hangs on the wrong tree to save man from his choice so he could be reunited with the tree of life. And so that's why, you look at it from an earthly standpoint, makes no sense. You look at it from God's standpoint in the story of Scripture, it all fits together perfectly. And it's just amazing when we can do that and put that in its context.
Yep. One last note, historical note. Constantinople, the king Constantinople, ended crucifixion, and it was one of the historical events that happened around 400 something, 300 something, 400.
300 something,
Yeah, 300 something, and so just kind of a nerdy fact at the end of the class. Thank you for your attention.